I never thought music could betray me. For years, concerts had been my sanctuary. The one place where the chaos of life was drowned out by guitars screaming into the sky and crowds moving like waves in the ocean. Riot Fest was supposed to be another escape, another chance to lose myself in the madness, another reminder that no matter how broken I felt, there was still something louder than my thoughts. But that night, in the middle of flashing lights and punk rock anthems, my past found me again. She was there, my ex-wife. The woman I once believed was my forever. She wasn't alone. Her hand was tightly wrapped in the fingers of another man, her husband now. I froze in the crowd, swallowed by thousands of strangers, yet more exposed than I had ever felt in my life. She turned her head, and for one unbearable second our eyes locked. And in those eyes I saw it, tears. Not rage, not regret, but something so human, so raw, that it shook me to my core. It's strange, isn't it? How a single glance can feel like years crashing into you all at once. I saw our first kiss hidden behind bleachers. I saw our fights in the kitchen that echoed into silence. I saw the way she left me, her back turned, the sound of the door shutting harder than any slam a heart could take. And now, at Riot Fest of all places, I saw her again, standing there with someone who wasn't me, but whose shadow now stretched over everything I once called mine. I wanted to look away. God knows I wanted to, but my body betrayed me. I kept staring, caught in that collision of music and memory. Around me, people shouted lyrics, hands flew into the air, guitars rattled every rib in my chest, and yet all I could hear was the sound of her breath the last night she told me goodbye. That night I promised myself I would never chase her again. But what do you do when she shows up in the middle of your escape, and her eyes are asking questions her lips won't dare to? In that moment, I wasn't at Riot Fest anymore. I was back in our apartment, staring at her handwriting on a yellow note taped to the fridge. "I can't do this anymore," she wrote. A sentence so simple, but it shattered me in ways I didn't think were possible. That note became the ghost that followed me everywhere, through bars, through lonely nights, through music that couldn't save me. And now here she was, flesh and blood, not a ghost at all, crying in front of me with a man who held the pieces I once dropped. Subscribe to Letters from Pain. Because sometimes the hardest letters are the ones we never send, and yet they keep writing themselves inside our chest. I don't know what she was thinking in that second. Maybe she wanted to look at me with pride, to show me she had moved on and built a new life. Or maybe those tears meant she still carried the same heaviness I did, the same regret, the same questions that never let us sleep. Moves forward without asking permission. My fists clenched, not out of anger toward him, but out of anger toward time itself. How could something that once burned so fiercely be reduced to this awkward silence between two people standing yards apart, pretending music could cover up the sound of their breaking hearts? Riot Fest wasn't loud enough, not for this, not for me. I turned away before she could see me crumble. The crowd swallowed me again, strangers pushing, music exploding, lights blinding, but inside I was quiet, too quiet. I thought if I ran fast enough I could leave her behind with the noise. But she followed me, in my veins, in my memory, in that single look that will haunt me for the rest of my life. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because this is only the beginning. When I finally broke away from the crowd, I found myself leaning against the fence near the back of the festival grounds. The music still thundered behind me, but out there, away from the chaos, I could almost breathe again. My chest rose and fell like I had just sprinted a mile, though all I'd done was look into the eyes of a woman who used to be my home. I lit a cigarette, something I told myself I'd quit a dozen times already, but at that moment the burn in my lungs felt like the only thing reminding me I was alive. Each drag carried memories I didn't ask for. Her laugh, soft like a secret. Her touch, electric and fleeting. The way she used to rest her head on my chest as if the world outside didn't exist. I hated that my body still remembered her, even when my mind begged to forget. The smoke curled upward, disappearing into the night sky. I wondered if my life had been nothing but smoke too, something beautiful for a moment, then gone, leaving behind nothing but a bitter smell. That thought tore into me harder than the music ever could. I don't think people understand what it's like to see someone you loved build a life without you. They talk about moving on as if it's just a chapter you close, but the truth is, you don't close it. The pages stick to your fingers. They bleed into every sentence you try to write after. And then, one night, you're standing in a crowd of strangers, and suddenly the past is there again, bleeding through your skin, asking why you ever thought you could outrun it. That night I kept asking myself, did she cry because she missed me, or did she cry because she wished she'd never seen me again? There's a difference, but I don't know which one would hurt more. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because some stories don't ask for an audience, but they demand a witness. The thing about Riot Fest is that it doesn't wait for your heartbreak. Bands switch, lights flash, and the crowd screams as if the universe is spinning exactly as it should. My universe, however, had collapsed. The music felt like noise now. I didn't care who was playing. I didn't care about the songs. I didn't care about anything except the fact that the woman who once swore she'd love me until death was crying in the arms of another man. I thought about walking back to her, just once. To look her in the eye and ask if she still thought about the life we lost. But then I imagined her silence, or worse, her honesty. I wasn't strong enough to survive either, so I stayed where I was, choking on my cigarette, my heart a battlefield where hope and regret were tearing each other apart. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe minutes, maybe hours. Time doesn't flow the same way when you're bleeding inside. But eventually, the world started moving again, pulling me back into its current. Strangers laughed around me, spilling beer, stumbling into the night, shouting lyrics that would mean nothing tomorrow. Life was happening for them. For me, life had stopped. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes survival is just learning how to keep breathing when the world refuses to wait. I left the festival grounds before the last band took the stage. My friends would have stayed, my younger self would have stayed, but I couldn't. Every guitar riff sounded like her name. Every shout from the crowd felt like a reminder that she was still inside, probably leaning against her husband's shoulder, maybe wiping away the tears I had seen. The thought of her laughing again so soon after crying in front of me made me sick. The streets outside were quieter. Neon lights flickered from bars on the corner, and the cool air carried the faint echo of music from blocks away. I walked slowly, hands in my pockets, as if dragging my body forward would somehow slow down the storm in my chest. It's funny how memory works. One moment I was staring at the cracked pavement. The next I was back in college, sitting in a coffee shop where I first saw her. She had books stacked on her table, a messy bun barely holding her hair together, and an expression that told the world she didn't have time for nonsense. But when I asked if the seat across from her was taken, she smiled. That smile destroyed every defense I thought I had. We were inseparable after that. Every festival, every road trip, every midnight run to the gas station for snacks, we did it together. She was my best friend before she was my wife, and maybe that's why losing her hurt so much. You can survive losing a lover, but losing the one person who knew every version of you? That's a different kind of death. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes the past isn't just memory, it's a wound that never closes. I tried to remind myself that not all of it was perfect. Love rarely is. We fought like wildfire, both of us stubborn, both convinced we were right even when we were wrong. She hated the way I worked late, the way I lost myself in things that didn't matter. I hated the way she shut down when she was angry, retreating into silence that lasted for days. But despite it all, I thought we were unbreakable. I thought passion was enough. The cracks showed slowly. Nights she stayed out late with friends I didn't know. Arguments that lasted longer than apologies. A silence that grew between us, thick and heavy, until even sitting on the same couch felt like being in two different worlds. I kept telling myself it was temporary. Every couple goes through rough patches, right? That's what I believed. Until the morning I found the note on the fridge. I can't do this anymore. 7 words. That's all it took to end a marriage, to shatter the foundation of everything I thought I knew. No explanation, no fight, just an empty apartment and the sound of my own heart breaking. Walking alone that night after Riot Fest, I realized something I hadn't admitted to myself before. I never really healed from that note. I pretended I did. I went out with friends. I drowned myself in music. I laughed when I had to. But inside, the wound stayed raw. And seeing her again only proved it. Time doesn't heal everything. Some scars stay open forever. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because if you've ever loved someone so deeply that their absence feels like amputation, you already know these words by heart. By the time I reached my apartment, the city had already fallen into its midnight silence. The world outside slowed down, but inside me everything was still running wild. I dropped my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and collapsed onto the couch like a man who had just survived a war. In some ways, I had. The room was dark, except for the dull glow of the streetlight seeping through the blinds. I didn't turn on the lamp. I didn't pour myself a drink. I just sat there, staring at nothing, feeling the weight of 1,000 memories pressing down on me. I could still see her eyes, wet and glistening in the chaos of Riot Fest. I could still see the way her husband pulled her close, like a prize he'd won, like a reminder that she was no longer mine. I reached for my notebook, the one I kept tucked under the couch cushion. Writing had always been my last refuge. When the noise in my head got too loud, I let the pen take over. I didn't care if the words made sense. I didn't care if anyone ever read them. All I cared about was bleeding onto the page in ink instead of in silence. I wrote about her, about us, about the way love can feel like fire, warming you one moment, burning you alive the next. I wrote about the note she left, about the ghost of her laughter that still haunted the walls of my apartment. And then I wrote about Riot Fest, about the crowd, the music, and the unbearable truth that no matter how far I ran, I could never run far enough. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes the only way to survive heartbreak is to turn your bleeding into words. I don't know how long I sat there, hunched over that notebook, scribbling like a man possessed. My handwriting grew sloppy, my sentences tangled, but I didn't stop. It was like my body knew this was the only chance I had to drain the poison before it drowned me completely. When my hand finally gave up, when the ink smudged across the page and the words blurred into black streaks, I leaned back and stared at the ceiling. I thought of her again. Was she sleeping now, curled up beside her husband, safe in a world I no longer belonged to? Or was she lying awake, staring at the ceiling too, replaying that 1 second when our eyes had met in the middle of a festival that should have swallowed us whole? I'll never know. That's the cruel part about love once it dies. You stop getting answers. You stop being part of their story. All you're left with are questions that echo in your chest like an empty hallway. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine a life without her shadow. A life where Riot Fest didn't mean heartbreak. A life where seeing her face wouldn't feel like being stabbed with memories I couldn't bury. But the harder I tried, the clearer her image became. Maybe that's what it means to love someone forever. Not that they stay with you, but that their ghost never leaves. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because ghosts of love don't disappear, they just learn to live inside you. The morning after Riot Fest, I woke with a heaviness that coffee couldn't fix. My notebook lay open on the coffee table, pages filled with the messy handwriting of a man unraveling. I skimmed over the words and it felt like I was reading someone else's life, someone I barely recognized. But it was mine. Every broken sentence, every aching confession, it was mine. I sat there in silence, the city already alive outside my window, and I thought about the years that had passed since she left. I had dated other women, tried to build something new, tried to fill the emptiness she left behind, but nothing ever lasted. No matter how kind they were, no matter how much they cared, it always ended the same way, with me staring at them and realizing they weren't her. It wasn't fair to them. I knew that. I told myself I'd moved on, that I was ready for love again, but deep down, I was still comparing every laugh, every kiss, every moment to her, and nobody could compete with a ghost. There was one woman, Claire. She was patient, funny, the kind of person who could light up a room without even trying. For a while, I thought maybe she could save me, but even on our best nights, when she'd fall asleep beside me, I'd lie awake and picture someone else's face. That's when I realized I wasn't looking for love, I was looking for a replacement, and replacements never work. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes the cruelest truth is that healing doesn't come from finding someone new, It comes from facing what you lost. I remember Claire asking me once, "Do you still love her?" It was late. We were sitting on my balcony, the city lights stretching out in front of us like stars. I wanted to lie. I wanted to say no, to tell her she was enough, to tell her the past was behind me. But the words stuck in my throat. Silence can be an answer too, and my silence told her everything she needed to know. She left 2 weeks later. That's the thing about carrying ghosts. You don't just hurt yourself, you hurt everyone who tries to love you afterward. They feel it, even if you don't say it out loud. They see it in your eyes when you drift too far into memory, when you smile at the wrong thought, when you flinch at a song that should mean nothing to you. And now, after all these years, after every failed attempt to build something new, she shows up at Riot Fest with her husband, and the cycle begins again. The wound reopens. The ghost sharpens its claws. And I'm reminded that maybe I never stopped bleeding in the first place. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because some scars don't fade, they become part of who you are. Her image never left me. It was more than memory now. It was a shadow that lingered behind my every action, behind every attempt to move forward. I found myself replaying that moment over and over, her tears glistening under the flashing lights, the way her husband's arm held her as if to shield her from the world, and from me. I couldn't stop wondering what those tears meant. Did they mean regret? Loneliness? A fleeting wish that she had stayed? Or were they simply a reflection of the life she had chosen, the life I wasn't part of anymore? I didn't know, and that uncertainty became its own kind of torment. I tried to tell myself it wasn't fair to read too much into it. People cry for all kinds of reasons, but I couldn't help it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, remembered the warmth of her hand in mine, and felt the emptiness that had followed me for years. That night, she had let herself be vulnerable in front of me, even if only for a second, and it tore through the careful walls I had built around my heart. Subscribe to Letters from Pain. Because sometimes seeing someone you loved suffer is the cruelest reminder that love never truly dies. It just changes form. I kept asking myself if she ever thought of me in quiet moments, if she ever felt the absence of what we had. Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Maybe she was perfectly happy now, living a life I had no part in, and those tears were just a fleeting fragment of a memory she had long buried. The not knowing became a weight I carried like a stone in my chest. Sometimes I caught myself imagining what it would be like to speak to her again, years later, in a different place, under different circumstances. Would we laugh, cry, or would we just nod politely, acknowledging the past without touching it, like strangers who had once been something sacred to each other? The thought both comforted and tormented me. I realized something painful. Love doesn't always end with closure. Often it ends with fragments, moments scattered across time that keep you tethered to someone long after they've gone. Riot Fest had reminded me of those fragments. Her tears, that fleeting glance, the unspoken words, they were all shards of a life that could never be reclaimed. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because fragments of love linger even when the people we loved are gone. I don't know how long I let myself sit in that space of longing. Nights blurred into days, days into sleepless nights. Music became a background hum, life a series of motions I went through without truly feeling them. I wrote constantly, filling page after page with my memories, my regrets, my unanswered questions. And in writing I found a kind of release, a temporary reprieve from the storm inside me. But even as I wrote, even as I poured my soul onto paper, I knew one thing with painful clarity. Seeing her that night at Riot Fest had reopened wounds I thought had begun to heal. It reminded me that some love doesn't vanish, it only hides, waiting for a moment to remind you that the past is never truly gone. After weeks of wrestling with my memories and the image of her at Riot Fest, I began to realize something I had avoided for far too long. The encounter wasn't just about her. It was about me, about who I had become in the years after she left, about the parts of myself I had neglected while trying to move on, about the way I had allowed grief to define me. I had spent so much time blaming her, blaming the universe, blaming circumstances, that I never paused to examine the man staring back at me in the mirror. The man who still carried a note taped to a fridge, still trembled at the thought of lost love, still clung to a past that could never return. Riot Fest had been a mirror, reflecting not only her tears, but the cracks I had ignored, the shadows I had fed with silence and regret. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes the hardest love story to face is the one written inside yourself. I thought about all the chances I had wasted, arguments I could have softened, gestures I could have made, moments of patience I had refused to give. I thought about the way I held on to pride instead of tenderness, the way I demanded understanding but gave none in return. And I realized that the love I had lost wasn't only about her leaving, it was also about the man I failed to be while we were together. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to cry, not just for her, not just for the life we could have had, but for myself. For the part of me that had been trapped, waiting for closure that never came. For the part of me that had believed that love meant possession rather than understanding. That night, the tears weren't sparked by a fleeting glance or a memory. They were sparked by truth, raw and unflinching. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because truth, no matter how painful, is the only thing that can set us free. I began to see the encounter at Riot Fest in a different light. It wasn't just heartbreak, it was a reckoning, a reminder that love leaves marks and that those marks can guide us if we let them. She had moved on, yes, but her tears had reminded me that life is fragile, that connections are fleeting, and that the way we love and the way we lose shapes everything that comes after. I started writing differently then. Not just about her, not just about the past, but about myself. About the man who had loved fiercely and lost. About the man who had been broken and still managed to breathe. About the man who would, someday, find a way to carry his past without letting it destroy his present. The notebook became my refuge once more. I filled pages with reflection, with lessons learned, with the ache of knowing that love doesn't always end in closure, but sometimes in understanding. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the weight on my chest began to lift. Not because she was gone, but because I had finally begun to see what had been waiting for me all along, the chance to forgive myself. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because forgiveness, especially for yourself, is the hardest love story to write. Sorrow. Slowly, I realized that life hadn't stopped for me. I had been standing still while the world moved on. I started writing more intentionally, not just to bleed out pain, but to understand it. I filled notebook after notebook with reflections on love, loss, and the man I wanted to become. Each word was a step toward freedom, each sentence a small act of courage. I began to see that Riot Fest hadn't just been a wound reopened, it had been a lesson disguised as agony. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because sometimes the only way to move forward is to confront the moments that haunt you. I also began reaching out to old friends I had neglected, people who reminded me that connection isn't just about romantic love. Conversations over coffee, laughter in bars, even shared silences, all of it was helping me rebuild the parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I realized that life is full of fragments, yes, but some of those fragments can become new foundations if we allow them to. And yet, I couldn't erase her entirely from my heart. I didn't want to. I came to understand that loving someone deeply doesn't always end with possession or closure. Sometimes it ends with acknowledgement, a quiet respect for what once was and the way it shaped you. Riot Fest had reminded me of that in the most painful, most beautiful way possible. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because some love stories are meant to be remembered, not relived. I started noticing the subtle ways I had changed. I was less reactive, more aware, more patient, not just with others, but with myself. I learned to sit with my emotions without letting them control me, to let memories exist without letting them define me, to feel sorrow without letting it turn into bitterness. It was slow, imperfect progress, but progress nonetheless. Every day was a choice. To carry the past lightly, to honor what had been without letting it imprison me, to live in the present while holding memory like a delicate artifact. Riot Fest had been a turning point. Not the end of pain, not the beginning of perfect clarity, but the moment I realized that I could survive heartbreak and still emerge wiser, stronger, more human. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because surviving heartbreak isn't about forgetting. It's about transforming the pain into something that can guide you forward. Months passed. and I slowly began to test the waters of life outside my memories. I started meeting new people, not with the desperate longing of a man trying to replace the past, but with cautious curiosity. Coffee dates, long walks, conversations that stretched into the night. They reminded me that connection could exist without fear, without ghosts controlling every moment. Still, I carried her with me. Her memory wasn't a chain. It was more like a compass. It reminded me of the intensity of love, of the vulnerability required to give yourself completely to another. And while her absence stung, it also taught me how to recognize the kind of love that was worth pursuing, the kind that didn't demand perfection, but demanded presence. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because the hardest lessons about love are learned in its absence. There was one woman, Elena, who entered my life quietly. She wasn't flashy or dramatic. She didn't remind me of her, and that was exactly why I noticed her. Her laughter had a softness that didn't demand attention. Her eyes carried a kindness that invited trust, and her presence was steady, like sunlight filtering through a room. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to compare her to the past. I simply felt myself, open and unguarded. Even then I was careful. I kept writing, kept reflecting, kept remembering what Riot Fest had taught me, that love is fragile, that it can leave marks that never fully fade, and that forgiveness, especially of oneself, is essential to moving forward. I didn't want to repeat mistakes. I wanted to approach love with honesty, patience, and courage, even if it meant risking heartbreak again. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because approaching love with an open heart after it's been broken is one of the bravest acts a person can attempt. Elena and I built slowly. Every laugh, every touch, every shared story felt like reclaiming a piece of myself I had lost. I began to see that my past didn't have to dictate my present. I could honor what I had experienced without letting it poison the new connections I was forming. And slowly the weight in my chest began to lift, replaced not by forgetfulness, but by understanding, acceptance, and cautious hope. And yet, sometimes at night, her memory would creep back in. Riot Fest, her tears, the life she had built without me, it was all still there, a reminder that some wounds never fully close. But now, the reminder was less like a knife and more like a lesson, that love, even lost, shapes the person you become. It can hurt, yes, but it can also guide you toward deeper connection, toward empathy, toward resilience. Subscribe to Letters from Pain, because some loves don't return, but they leave lessons that last a lifetime.